Story 1. Have you seen the news recently? Well, I sure have, and they don't paint a good picture. Ever since Boeing started falling apart, it has gone downhill. Now, I don't mean to defame them more than they already have, but it's not just them who are the problem. It's aircraft from every make that have crashed, and they are not crashing because of mechanical failure. Now, I know what you may be thinking. Who is this guy to have the nerve to talk about a serious and mysterious matter like a conspiracy theorist? Yes, I know that the AIG section of the ICAO is working tirelessly to find the causes of these crashes, like the Jeju air collision with a wall and a small plane crashing in Fullerton, California earlier today. But they won't find anything. They'll blame it on mechanical failures, a screw that wasn't held properly, no maintenance from an airline, and so on. Because there are so many things that can go wrong during a flight that it's easy to blame something that didn't cause the accident but certainly would have after a few flights. I know this because I'm an aircraft mechanic at my country's main airline, and I like to fly various aircraft during my off time. For my job, I'm the senior mechanic stationed at the capital's airport, which is the main hangar where repairs are made for the airline. In my free time, I fly ultralights, my own Cessna, and I also paraglide and skydive. As you can see, I love the air. It has become my life. I like to stay informed about developments in aviation. In September 2024, I started receiving more and more aircraft with serious problems, the most common being cracks in the internal fuselage and wing structure. I'm sure I don't need to tell you how dangerous that is. Our airline is called Regional Aeronautics, and it's small compared to the airlines you may fly. We operate 20 planes on 8 routes, mostly older Boeing 737s, 2 Airbus A320s, which are our fleet's crown jewels, and my favorite, a single 1976 Handley Page Jetstream, usually rented for private flights over short distances. At first I thought the incidents and damages were caused by our changing climate. I read an investigation that stated that nowadays there are more severe cases of invisible turbulence, the kind you and I are used to, which can't be spotted on radar or any other instruments and therefore can't be avoided, than 50 years ago. But by the end of November, I started to think it was something else. By that point, we had to ground 9 aircraft, and I calculated that by New Year's Eve, we wouldn't be able to sustain any routes reliably. They all had the same problem, structural damage. We even had to dismantle the whole upper part of the Jetstream's fuselage, which ended up being too much for the old craft. The airline decided to sell it as soon as they could. It was a miracle they didn't decide to scrap it. But it was sidelined until we repaired the other, more important planes. I decided I would take the Jetstream and repair it after hours, hoping to have it flying by Christmas. Surprisingly, the airline agreed that I could stay in the hangar after my shift was over, though they did state that they wouldn't pay me overtime. December 20th came, and as the Christmas rush approached, we were pressured to have the airplanes in flying condition as soon as possible. The grounded aircraft count had risen to 12, and the last 3 really terrified me. The first one arrived with its lower left wing looking like a cat had used it as a scratching post. 3 deep gashes tore from the leading edge nearly up to the engine. The second one was worse, with the same pattern of gashes, but near the nose of the plane. The damage was significant, damaging expensive sensors, and nearly causing the plane to lose control on the runway and result in an accident, similar to what happened recently in South Korea. All of those, however, paled in comparison to what happened to the third plane. It was one of the Airbus A320s. It had departed from the capital's airport, heading to the neighboring country's capital. At 5:00 p.m., it took off, and at 5:30 p.m., it sent a distress signal. It had lost its steering. It was a grueling hour before the aircraft managed to land safely back at the capital's airport. When it arrived at the hangar, it was terrifying. If I had thought the first plane looked like a cat had scratched it, this one looked like it had been attacked by a whole litter aircraft painted white from the factory, and then airlines color parts of them as they want: yellow, blue, red, green, purple, pink, whatever. Underneath all that, there is the natural silver and green of the aircraft. The third airplane had its fuselage's paint torn off, exposing the raw silver metal. It looked like a gaping wound, and these marks were all over the plane, small, large, elongated. I saw one that went neatly from the front of the aircraft to the back, splitting it into two halves. The wings and tail were in even worse condition. If the paint looked like an open wound, the scratches on the wing went down to the very structure. Critical components were damaged, wiring was cut, and sometimes straight up missing. When we identified the problem that caused the loss of steering, it was a miracle nothing worse happened. A gash had cut through the hydraulic lines going to the wings on both sides, and they had leaked empty. Usually the lines keep leaking for hours before running out, but these were drier than the Sahara. To say it bothered me was an understatement, especially after I found the gashes near the fuel lines. I was terrified. How could turbulence do so much damage to an aircraft? I accepted some structural damage. Fissures in the wings and internal structure were common during strong turbulence, and as long as they were treated in a short time, they weren't dangerous. But these gashes were new, and I couldn't understand how they had formed. One of my co-workers spoke up during lunch on the 22nd. I had raised the question to a group of them. He said, "Easy, it's them aliens." I raised an eyebrow, confused. The airport's lunch hall felt eerily silent after that. He continued, "You know, the ones spotted over the skies of New York and Chicago recently. Even the Pentagon doesn't know what's the deal with them." I wasn't sure if he was being honest or just messing with me. After he finished talking, I couldn't think of anything to say to break the uneasy silence in the lunch hall. Then an overly nasal voice called from the table over, "Now I don't know what BS you're talking about, but you're most certainly wrong." We all turned to look. It was a mechanic for an international airline who was in the capital to scout for a possible hub. He was tall and very, very slim, like Slenderman Slim. He looked like the type of guy who could win a hide-and-seek contest by just turning sideways. He had short brown hair, a white face with freckles, and thick-rimmed glasses that made him look like he was going to raise his index finger, show some bunny teeth, say, "Actually," and spill the most useless fact ever. He definitely had the voice for it. The guy stood there, pushing his glasses up his nose, and said, "We all know that aliens do not exist, and we all know that summer has been way too long because of El Niño." Everyone in the lunch hall nodded in agreement. He continued, "So it's actually the summer wind that warms the earth and causes severe turbulence, making airplanes break." I nodded too. I had noticed something similar when I went paragliding. I had to wake up at 4 a.m. to fly because after 6 a.m. it got too turbulent and hard to steer. I had to use my parachute to land safely, but that didn't explain all the damage to the plane's body. The lunch hall was back to its usual noise, and I decided not to continue the topic. I thought it was better to talk to one of the pilots who experienced the turbulence. On the evening of December 26th, I had finished my shift and was fixing the jet stream. Because so many planes were grounded, I hadn't had time to work on it, so the repair date was moved to the 31st, just before the new year. The night crew was working, and some of them helped me while taking breaks from bigger aircraft. I was humming a tune I had learned from a skydiving veteran when the hangar doors opened and a person walked in. At first, he looked like a high-ranking airline manager, but as he came closer, I saw he was a pilot. He was tall, with a neat haircut, blonde hair, blue eyes, and a clean shave. He wore a black pilot suit with the airline's logo, a bird in the colors of our flag, medals, a tie, and aviator glasses in his breast pocket. He had matching black pants and formal leather shoes. He held his cap under his arm. He walked in, looking at the work being done on the aircraft. Luckily, no other planes had joined us since the Airbus. I was proud of my work, riveting the second-to-last panel to the fuselage when he stopped to admire my progress. "Nice job, man. This one looks as good as new," he chuckled, looking at the unfinished part. "You're really working hard on this one." I smiled. "Yeah, I want to have it ready to fly by New Year's," I said, happy that someone noticed my work, though the damage is quite worrying. "No turbulence could cause this or that," I said, pointing to the Airbus behind me. When he looked at the plane, the pilot flinched. "Holy," he said, whistling. "I didn't think it was that bad." "Are you the pilot?" I asked, hoping for a yes. "In the flesh," he said, pointing at himself. "I had to stop by and see what happened." I looked at him, interested. "So, What really happened? I asked nervously. He didn't answer for a few seconds, so I continued. You know, because that is definitely not from turbulence. I agree, he said thoughtfully. I don't know what really happened. It's like one moment I was setting the autopilot, and the next I was struggling with the controls to keep the plane in the air. They got tighter and stronger with every shake and rattle, and then it started creaking. I see, I said, not really understanding. There's just something I remember, he said. I told myself I had to report it once we landed, but I can't remember what it was. He stayed silent, deep in thought, as he looked at the Airbus. I went back to riveting the panel and checking for leaks until he turned to leave. Well, I'd like to see this old de Havilland finished, he said, extending a hand. Rowan. Josh, I said, shaking his hand. Well, Josh, see you on the 31st, he said, leaving the hangar quickly. I finished early, on the 29th, and planned the test flight. I got approval from the airline after showing them my flying license and telling them a pilot would join me. They weren't thrilled, but they agreed. I managed to contact Rowan, who was excited to co-pilot the test flight. On the day of the flight, I woke up, ate cereal with yogurt. Don't judge, I forgot to buy milk and no store was open on the 1st, and headed to work. My shift ended at 7 p.m, and I felt like time was moving so slowly. Finally, my shift ended, and I excitedly clocked out and jumped into the cockpit. I pulled up a checklist and radioed the tower. Rowan arrived a few minutes later, apologizing for the traffic. I told him it was okay. After refueling, we headed to the runway the control tower directed us to. The sky was getting dark, and I could barely see the outlines of the trees at the end of the runway. Okay, said Rowan. I've got the checklist ready. Where are we going? We're heading to an airfield on the other side of the mountains, I explained. There's no turbulence, and it's owned by an associate of the airline. We needed to test the cabin's pressurization, the fuselage's integrity, and the engine feel. Regional Aeronautics Flight 073HM. This is air traffic control. Do you copy? Over. Copy. Regional Aeronautics 073HM. Over. Regional Aeronautics Flight 073HM, cleared for takeoff. Wind is 20 knots northward. Path Charlie 6. Fly well. Over. We started the takeoff procedure, engines at maximum throttle, and took to the skies. The flight was uneventful. We quickly rose to 15,000 feet to clear the mountains and descended to the airfield. After refueling, I checked the fuselage for any signs of damage, but there were none. I was thrilled. Everything was going well. There was no turbulence expected because it was late at night, and there usually wasn't much wind at night. When it was time to return, I had one last test to do, the engine feel test. The old Handley Page Jetstream often had engine problems because its propeller engines were getting old. It was important to do this test during regular checkups. We had to rise to 25,000 feet and push the throttle to the maximum. If the plane couldn't exceed 215 knots, it was time to look for a replacement engine. I'm really worried about this part, Rowan said as we climbed up from the airfield. The turbulence started right when I reached cruising altitude before, and I don't know if this plane can handle it. It's 9 at night, so there shouldn't be much wind up there, I tried to reassure him. We only need to reach 215 knots, then we'll start landing. I'm not sure about this, Rowan said, looking uncertain. Do we really need to do this? I took my hand off the controls and raised my pinky finger at Rowan. Promise, I said. If not, I owe you donuts. All right then, Rowan said after a moment, linking his pinky with mine. Air traffic control, this is Regional Aeronautics 073HM over, I said into the radio. Regional Aeronautics 073HM, this is ATC over, came the response through the crackling radio. Regional Aeronautics 073HM, we need to climb to 25,000 feet, are we cleared? Over. Regional Aeronautics 073HM, cleared to climb to 25,000 feet, heading northwest. Wind is 10 knots north, 25 knots north at 25,000 feet, no traffic over. As we climbed higher, the flight became more unstable. I had to quickly adjust the controls to stay on course, which felt strange. We finally reached 25,000 feet, leveled out, and slowly increased the throttle. The twin turbomecha Astazoo engines purred at 40,000 revolutions per minute as the plane reached 227 knots. I got ready to land, pulling out the checklist and reviewing the landing procedures. ATC, this is RA Flight 073HM, ready for landing. Over, I said into the radio, hearing a voice respond. RA Flight 073HM, this is ATC, cleared for landing on runway 2L. Keep heading down Gamma 7 until 10,000 feet. Wind is 18 knots northeast, no traffic. Over. We started descending when, at 20,000 feet, a strange turbulence began shaking the plane. It started softly, but gradually became more violent, causing the plane to shake wildly from side to side. Strange, ripping sounds came from outside. The electronics began to fail. There were moments of complete darkness, with no light from the moon or stars. Amidst the shaking, I felt like someone was walking on the plane's body, scraping it with something sharp. I looked out the windows, but saw nothing. I noticed Rowan was frozen, likely remembering his past experience. I shook him to bring him back to his senses. The scraping grew stronger and more frantic as we descended quickly, reaching 16,000 feet. "I need you to hold the controls for a second," I shouted to Rowan, struggling to be heard over the noise. "I think someone is outside the plane." "Someone is what?" Rowan asked in panic. He took a deep breath and calmed down, focusing on the controls. I turned to look out the left side of the airplane. What I saw was terrifying. A red creature with massive wings was at the back of the plane, trying to get in using a sword. Above it, a red horse with wings was galloping, creating powerful turbulence. 12,000 feet, Rowan said, his voice strained from pulling the yoke. The creature outside raised its glowing orange sword and thrust it against the plane, making a deep hole and causing the cabin to depressurize. Oxygen masks dropped down, and Rowan and I quickly put them on. There was one last jarring sound and everything calmed down. The plane stabilized, but the cabin was dark and the engines stopped. From behind the cockpit, I heard heavy footsteps and a dragging sound. I turned to look at Rowan, who was terrified, his eyes wide. I felt the same fear, unable to move. Rowan and I gripped the yoke tightly. The landing gear wouldn't deploy, so we had to decide. Do we land like this, or try to restart the engines? A closer footstep and a screech made me choose to land, even though I tried to restart the engines with no success. There was no power. Another step came right next to the door. I focused on the runway, not daring to look. A sharp, fiery edge appeared in my vision, signaling the creature had broken into the cockpit. Its features were so alien that I doubted my sanity. The creature's sword flickered with flames, and it grinned, revealing jagged teeth that glinted like polished blades. "You think you can escape?" It hissed, its voice vibrating through the cockpit, felt deep in the bones. The air grew heavy with the scent of blood, though neither of us was wounded. Rowan trembled, gripping the yoke tightly, and muttered, What do you want?" The creature didn't answer. Instead, it raised its hand, and the cockpit lights flickered and died. The dashboard sparked, the instruments froze, and the plane began an uncontrolled descent. The creature laughed, a sound that filled every corner of my mind. I wanted to scream, but couldn't. Outside, the stars vanished. Massive, silent ships slid into view, forming patterns that twisted and moved. My heart raced as I realized they were spelling something, but the letters shifted before I could understand. The creature pointed its sword at Rowan, and his head snapped back violently. Blood dripped from his nose as he struggled to speak. "Josh, Get us down. Get us. His voice faded. Then it turned to me. Pilot, do you know what it feels like to be insignificant? Its voice was in my skull, resonating like tortured metal. You'll understand soon enough. The plane shuddered. I reached for the controls, but my hands wouldn't move. The creature leaned closer, its fiery presence hot. You can't save them. None of you can. This world will burn, and we'll watch. The windshield shattered inward, and the roar of rushing air drowned everything out. I felt the creature's searing grip on my shoulder before the world exploded into light. The last thing I heard was its voice, whispering intimately, "You'll kneel one way or another." Then, blackness. I woke up in a hospital. I keep getting notifications about airplane accidents with the same pattern. Turbulence, shrapnel, uncontrollable descent, death. I know they caused it. I know he caused it. They will attack from the skies. They own the skies now, and they won't hesitate to destroy anything in their way. Tell me, when was the last time you saw a bird or heard that airplane travel was safe? Because I'm sure it's not today. Story 2. For the past 2.5 years, I've been living in the far north of the Scottish Highlands. I live in a small coastal town called Thurso, which is the northernmost town on the British mainland. My gloomy hometown in Yorkshire, England, seemed like a distant memory when my dad and his partner told me they had bought an old house up here. I jumped at the chance to move. They told me Caithness sounded perfect. The town's river had seals and otters, the sea had dolphins and orcas, and at certain times of the year you could see the northern lights in the night sky. I was so excited to finally live in the Scottish Highlands, full of beautiful mountains, amazing wildlife, and vibrant culture. But soon I realized that the place I had moved to was far from the dream destination I had imagined. Many tourists come here each summer, but when you actually live here in a harsh and freezing coastal climate, it feels more like a place of suffering. It feels cursed. This might sound like a superstition, but what really makes me believe it is the disturbing things that have washed up on shore. Each one seems worse than the last, and they all have to do with death. The first strange thing I discovered happened a couple of months after I moved to Caithness. In my spare time, I like to explore the coastline around Thurso. I decided to explore the area east of Thurso. On the right-hand side of the mouth of the river, there's an old castle ruin. Beyond that, there's a cliff trail around the eastern coastline. I decided to explore this trail with my dog, Maisie, on a very windy and rainy day. We went down the cliff trail and onto the bedrocks by the sea. As we made our way around the base of a cliff, we found something shocking. There were dozens of dead seabirds all over the bedrock floor. It was as if they had just fallen from the sky and washed ashore. I assumed they had crashed into the rocks or been swept into the sea due to the stormy weather. Feeling uneasy, I decided to go back home instead of risking getting blown off the cliff trail. A day or two later, I went back to explore further down the coast. A woman with her young daughter stopped me. Shouting across the road through the heavy rain, she told me she had just come from that direction. She said there was a warning sign for dog walkers telling them that the area was full of dead seabirds that had died from bird flu. The warning advised dog walkers to keep their dogs on a leash, as bird flu was contagious to them. This worried me because Maisie had gotten close to the dead seabirds to sniff them the day before. There was something strange about meeting this woman. She and her daughter were walking a dog that looked exactly like Maisie, a small black and white border collie. Maybe that's why she was so eager to warn me, seeing her own dog in mine and wanting to protect it. But this detail felt weird to me, almost like an omen. It felt as though something else, disguised as a coincidence, was warning me. Curious about the warning sign, I thanked the woman and continued with Maisie towards the trail. We reached the entrance of the castle ruins, and on the gate I saw the bright yellow sign with contagion symbols. If the woman's warning wasn't enough to make me turn around, this sign definitely was. I headed back into town, worried that Maisie might now be contagious. Thankfully, Maisie was fine. I later learned that bird flu was common in the region, so dead seabirds were nothing new. However, what I found washed up on the town's beach a year later was far more sinister. The following summer, I was walking with Maisie along the town's beach, which stretched from one end of Thurso Bay to the other. I didn't really like this beach because it was always covered in stacks of seaweed. The seaweed stunk of sulfur and attracted swarms of flies and midges. Even if they weren't on you, you felt like you were being bitten all over. One thing I did love about this beach was that on a clear day, you could see one of the Orkney Islands in the distance. On cloudy or foggy days, it was as if the island never existed, and all you saw was the ocean and a false horizon. One summer day, I was walking with Maisie along the beach. I let her off her leash so she could explore and find new smells from the ocean. She was rummaging through the seaweed when she found something. I went to see what it was and realized it was something I had never seen before. Lying on top of the seaweed was an animal skeleton. I wasn't sure what kind of animal it was, but it was either a sheep or a goat. There were many farms in Caithness and across the sea in Orkney. My best guess was that an animal from one of Orkney's coastal farms had fallen off a ledge or cliff, drowned, and its remains eventually washed up here. Although I was initially shocked by the skeleton, grinning up at me with its molar-like teeth, something else about this animal quickly caught my eye. The upper body was indeed skeletal remains completely picked clean and white, but the lower body was still intact. It still had its hooves and all its wet fur. The fur was dark grey, and as far as I could see, all the meat underneath was still there. Although disturbed by this carcass, I was also very confused. What I didn't understand was why the upper body of this animal had been completely picked off, while the lower part hadn't even been touched. What was even stranger was that the lower body hadn't decomposed yet. It still looked fresh. I can still picture the image of this dead animal in my mind. At the time, one of the first impressions I had was that it seemed almost satanic. It reminded me of the image of Baphomet, a goat's head on a man's body. What made me think this was not only the dark goat-like legs, but also the position the carcass was in. Although the carcass belonged to a goat or sheep, the way the skeleton was positioned almost made it appear human-like. The skeleton was laid on its back with an arm and leg on each side of its body. However, what I also have to mention about this incident is that, like the dead seabirds and the warnings of the concerned woman, this skeleton also felt like an omen, a bad omen. I thought it might have been at the time, and to tell you the truth, it was. Not long after finding this skeleton washed up on the town's beach, my personal life suddenly took a very dark and somewhat tragic downward spiral. I almost wish I could go into the details of what happened, as it would only support the idea of how much of a bad omen this skeleton turned out to be, but it's all rather personal. While I've still lived in this god-forsaken place, I have come across one more thing that has washed ashore. Although I can't say whether it was more or less disturbing than the Baphomet-like skeleton I had found, it was definitely bone-chilling. 6 or so months later, during the Christmas season, I was still recovering from the personal thing that had happened to me, almost foreshadowed by the Baphomet skeleton. It was also around this time that I had just gotten out of a long-distance relationship and was only now finding closure from it. Feeling as though I had finally gotten over it, I decided I wanted to go on a long hike by myself along the cliff trail east of Thurso. So the day after Christmas, Boxing Day, I got my backpack together, packed a lunch for myself, and headed out at 6 a.m. The hike along the trail took me all day, and by the evening I had walked so far that I actually discovered what I first thought was a ghost town. What I found was an abandoned port settlement, which had the creepiest looking old stone houses, as well as what looked like the ruins of an ancient round tower. As it turned out, this was actually the Castletown Heritage Centre, a tourist spot. It seemed I had walked so far around the rugged terrain that I was now 10 miles outside of Thurso. On the other side of this settlement were the distant cliffs of Dunnet Bay, which compared to the cliffs I had already trekked along, were far grander. Although I could feel my legs finally begin to give way and was already anticipating a long journey back along the trail, I decided that I was going to cross the bay and reach the cliffs, and then make my way back home. Considering what I would find there, this is the point in the journey where thankfully, Maisie was fine. I later learned that bird flu was common in the region, so dead seabirds were nothing new. However, what I found washed up on the town's beach a year later was far more sinister. The following summer, I was walking with Maisie along the town's beach, which stretched from one end of Thurso Bay to the other. I didn't really like this beach because it was always covered in stacks of seaweed. The seaweed stunk of sulfur and attracted swarms of flies and midges. Even if they weren't on you, you felt like you were being bitten all over. One thing I did love about this beach was that on a clear day, you could see one of the Orkney Islands in the distance. On cloudy or foggy days, it was as if the island never existed, and all you saw was the ocean and a false horizon. One summer day, I was walking with Maisie along the beach. I let her off her leash so she could explore and find new smells from the ocean. She was rummaging through the seaweed when she found something. I went to see what it was, and realized it was something I had never seen before. Lying on top of the seaweed was an animal skeleton. I wasn't sure what kind of animal it was, but it was either a sheep or a goat. There were many farms in Caithness and across the sea in Orkney. My best guess was that an animal from one of Orkney's coastal farms had fallen off a ledge or cliff, drowned, and its remains eventually washed up here. Although I was initially shocked by the skeleton, grinning up at me with its molar-like teeth, something else about this animal quickly caught my eye. The upper body was indeed skeletal remains, completely picked clean and white, but the lower body was still intact. It still had its hooves and all its wet fur. The fur was dark grey, and as far as I could see, all the meat underneath was still there. Although disturbed by this carcass, I was also very confused. What I didn't understand was why the upper body of this animal had been completely picked off, while the lower part hadn't even been touched. What was even stranger was that the lower body hadn't decomposed yet. It still looked fresh. I can still picture the image of this dead animal in my mind. At the time, one of the first impressions I had was that it seemed almost satanic. It reminded me of the image of Baphomet, a goat's head on a man's body. What made me think this was not only the dark goat-like legs, but also the position the carcass was in. Although the carcass belonged to a goat or sheep, the way the skeleton was positioned almost made it appear human-like. The skeleton was laid on its back with an arm and leg on each side of its body. However, what I also have to mention about this incident is that, like the dead seabirds and the warnings of the concerned woman, this skeleton also felt like an omen, a bad omen. I thought it might have been at the time, and to tell you the truth, it was. Not long after finding this skeleton washed up on the town's beach, my personal life suddenly took a very dark and somewhat tragic downward spiral. I almost wish I could go into the details of what happened, as it would only support the idea of how much of a bad omen this skeleton turned out to be, but it's all rather personal. While I've still lived in this god-forsaken place, I have come across one more thing that has washed ashore. Although I can't say whether it was more or less disturbing than the Baphomet-like skeleton I had found, it was definitely bone-chilling. 6 or so months later, during the Christmas season, I was still recovering from the personal thing that had happened to me, almost foreshadowed by the Baphomet skeleton. It was also around this time that I had just gotten out of a long-distance relationship and was only now finding closure from it. Feeling as though I had finally gotten over it, I decided I wanted to go on a long hike by myself along the cliff trail east of Thurso. So the day after Christmas, Boxing Day, I got my backpack together, packed a lunch for myself, and headed out at 6 a.m. The hike along the trail took me all day, and by the evening I had walked so far that I actually discovered what I first thought was a ghost town. What I found was an abandoned port settlement, which had the creepiest looking old stone houses, as well as what looked like the ruins of an ancient round tower. As it turned out, this was actually the Castletown Heritage Centre, a tourist spot. It seemed I had walked so far around the rugged terrain that I was now 10 miles outside of Thurso. On the other side of this settlement were the distant cliffs of Dunnet Bay, which compared to the cliffs I had already trekked along were far grander. Although I could feel my legs finally begin to give way and was already anticipating a long journey back along the trail, I decided that I was going to cross the bay and reach the cliffs, and then make my way back home. Considering what I would find there, this is the point in the journey where I should have stopped. By the time I was making my way around the bay, it had become very dark. I had already walked past more than half of the bay, but the cliffs didn't feel any closer. It was at this point that I decided I really needed to turn around, as walking back along the cliff trail at night was going to be dangerous. For the parts of the trail that led down to the base of the cliffs, I really couldn't afford for the tide to cut off my route. I made my way back through the abandoned settlement of the Heritage Centre, and at night this settlement definitely felt more like a ghost town. Shining my phone flashlight in the windows of the old stone houses, I was expecting to see a face or something peer out at me. What surprisingly made these houses scarier at night were a handful of old fishing boats that had been left outside them. The wood they were made from looked very old, and the paint had mostly been weathered off, but what was more concerning was that in this abandoned ghost town of a settlement, I wasn't alone. A van had pulled up with 3 or 4 young men getting out. I wasn't sure what they were doing exactly, but they were burning things in a trash can. What it was they were burning, I didn't know. But as I made my way out of the abandoned settlement, every time I looked back at the men by the van, at least one of them was watching me. The abandoned settlement and the creepy men burning things by their van weren't even the creepiest things I came across on that hike. The creepiest thing I found actually came as soon as I decided to head back home, before I was even back at the Heritage Centre. Finally making my way back, I tried retracing my own footprints along the beach. It was so dark by now that I needed to use my phone flashlight to find them. As I wandered through the darkness, with only the dim brightness of the flashlight to guide me, I came across something. Ahead of me, I could see a dark silhouette of something in the sand. It was too far away for my flashlight to reach, but it seemed to me that it was just a big rock, so I wasn't too concerned. But for some reason, I wasn't 100% convinced either. The closer I got to it, the more I thought it could possibly be something else. I was right on top of it now, and the silhouette didn't look as much like a rock as I thought it did. If anything, it looked more like a very big fish, almost like a tuna fish. I didn't even realize fish could get that big in and around these waters. Still unsure whether this was just a rock or a dead fish of sorts, but too afraid to shine my light on it, I decided I was going to touch it with my foot. My first thought was that I was going to feel hard rock beneath me, only to realize the darkness had played a trick on me. I lifted up my foot and pressed it on the dark silhouette, but what I felt wasn't hard rock. It was squidgy. My first reaction was a little bit of shock, because if this wasn't a rock like I originally thought, then it was something else and had probably once been alive. Almost afraid to shine my light on whatever this was, I finally worked up the courage to do it. Hoping this really was just a very big fish, I reluctantly shined my light on the dark, squidgy thing. But what the light revealed was something else. It was a seal, a dead seal pup. Seal carcasses do occasionally wash up in this region, and it wasn't even the first time I saw one. But as I studied this dead seal with my flashlight, feeling my own skin crawl as I did it, I suddenly noticed something alarming. This seal pup had a chunk of flesh bitten out of it. For all I knew, this poor seal pup could have been hit by a boat, and that's what caused the wound. But the wound was round and basically a perfect bite shape. Depending on the time of year, there are orcas around these waters, which obviously hunt seals. But this bite mark was no bigger than what a fully grown seal could make. Did another seal do this? I know other animals will sometimes eat their young, but I never heard of seals doing this. But what was even worse than the idea that this pup was potentially killed by its own species was that this pup, this poor little seal pup, was missing its skull. The skin was still there, but it was empty, lying flat on the sand. Just when I thought things couldn't get worse, I left the seal and kept walking back. That's when I saw another dark shape on the sand. As I got closer, I found another dead seal pup. This one also had the same wound, a bite mark, and just like the first one, its skull was missing. I could believe that they were killed by a boat or maybe another animal, but how did they both end up with the exact same wounds and missing their skulls? I didn't get it. These seals weren't torn apart. They only had one bite mark each. Would the animal that killed them really take their skulls? I didn't know. I still don't. But both of these seal pups were exactly the same. They died in the same way, which was weird. I probably knew how they died, but what happened to their skulls? It turns out that it's common to find seal carcasses without heads. If they tumble around in the surf for a while, the head can come off before washing up on the shore. Another answer could be scavengers. Sometimes other animals take the head away. I wasn't sure which animals, but at least I had more than one explanation for why these seals were missing their skulls, even if I didn't know which one was true. Even though I had an idea about the missing skulls, it still seemed strange that both seals were almost identical in how they died. Maybe one seal could lose its skull, but both? I guess so. Unlike other things I found washed ashore, these dead seals didn't feel like an omen. This was common for the region, but growing up in Yorkshire, England, where nothing much happens, and then moving to what felt like the edge of the world, and finding dead animals you only see in zoos, it stays with you. In the past 2.5 years that I've been here, I almost feel like this place is cursed. Not just because of the things that wash up on the shore. Dead things wash up all the time. But this place feels cursed for many reasons. Despite the natural beauty, it feels like a purgatory, a depressing place that attracts lost souls from all over the UK. Many locals leave, moving south to places like Glasgow, yet some people like me come here from far away. Mostly retired English couples choose this place to live comfortably before they die. Maybe they, like me, thought it would be idyllic, only to find out they were wrong. For the rest of the people, they're either junkies or criminals relocated here from across the country. You could say that Caithness is the UK's Alaska, a place where people come to get away from their past or themselves, but instead they face a cold, dark, depressing climate. Maybe this place isn't cursed. Maybe it's just a remote area in the far north of Scotland with a very harsh climate by UK standards. Either way, I won't be here much longer. Maybe the ghost that followed me here will follow me wherever I go next. A word of warning. If you choose to come here, make sure it's only in the summer. But whatever you do, if you have personal demons, don't move here. Story 3. There's an evolutionary term called carcinization. It's the process in which crustaceans evolve in such a way to eventually take the shape of a crab. Some people, particularly those who aren't, who only found out about the phenomena through Reddit posts or word of mouth, take this to mean that the evolutionary path of all creatures eventually leads to becoming a crab. As someone who is studying to become a marine biologist, I used to roll my eyes and correct people on the matter, which is a phenomena that was exclusively to crustaceans, and that they weren't becoming crabs, but merely taking a shape more similar to a crab's body. That's how it was supposed to work, at least. I was shocked to discover that I was the one in the wrong all along. I first observed the changes in late April. My neighbor, a somewhat portly young man named Jason, had begun to rapidly bald and shrink in size and posture despite his age. It was as if he was becoming an elderly man suddenly and uncontrollably at the age of 24, though I initially didn't think it was much more than an unfortunate case of biology or disease. The scientific part of me couldn't help but find some strange fascination in Jason's sudden deterioration. This fascination made it impossible for me not to study Jason's deformities and keep a quiet tally of the severity of the changes each time I saw him. This wasn't difficult, as Jason would soon come to see me on a sometimes even tri-weekly basis. I had begun to suspect that Jason, who by May had been completely bald and shrunken from 6'1" to 5'6" with a noticeable hunch in his back, had suddenly begun to lack in female attention. He had begun to rely more and more on my curiosity for companionship, which I didn't mind. It was a fine transactional relationship for me, wherein Jason got to have a little friendly attention a few times a week while I studied the increasingly rapid change to his physicality. By July, my mental tallies of Jason's condition became handwritten notes and entire page sketches in my journal. Fascinatingly, Jason was not just shrinking and losing his upright posture, but appeared to be flattening out, with his neck receding in such a way that his head appeared to be fused with his spine, which now was a nearly perfect acute angle with his pelvis. His skin was becoming coarse and rough, his fingers appeared to be fusing together, and his eyes were ever so slightly bulging out of his head. I was completely and utterly enthralled with Jason's condition, and I started to fall behind on coursework in my self-study of what was going on. He had the symptoms of many different diseases, but no one in particular, and none that made sense given his age and presumably good health prior to his transformation. Transformation really was the best word to describe it, because Jason no longer looked like Jason, 24-year-old suburban dwelling man, but had started to look more like a crab. That's when it hit me. What if somehow Jason was undergoing cocainization? Rather, some sort of new, unheard of hypercocainization. The thought was ridiculous and impossible given what we know about biology, but I couldn't get it out of my mind. Something primordial in my head saw Jason and recognized the crab he was becoming, like an evolutionary fear response designed to protect us from predators. It was a deep sense that couldn't be argued with, no matter how intelligent and rational I was, and no matter what the laws of science said could be possible. But science is not a static thing, as new discoveries every day change our understanding of life and the universe. Though I should rationally be afraid of what was happening to Jason, instead he became my discovery, my new thesis that would rocket me to the stop of the scientific world. I would study Jason and not allow anything to impede on his transformation, and present my findings to a world in awe of a new understanding of evolution. So, when I discovered Jason was going to be moving out, away from his home to be taken care of by family and specialist doctors, I knew something had to be done. It wasn't hard to get Jason over to my place. He most definitely confused my interest in his condition and our frequent interactions as affection, and the poor lonely man wouldn't leave without at least one more visit with his neighbor. I asked if he wanted a drink, and as he stepped into my kitchen, I couldn't help but stare in awe at what the light caught on Jason's skin. Out of Jason's skin protruded bone, layering thin across the lengths of his arms and at his shoulder blades. I ran my hands over it, and Jason whimpered, clearly sensitive to the touch, but too afraid to say anything about it. What I felt was a rough, rocky texture, bumpy in spots and serrated at the edges. Jason was growing chitin. He was producing a shell, in a process that seemed to be almost like a crab shedding. Only the old shell Jason was shedding was everything. That made him human. I knew then and there that I was right about his transformation and the importance of my discovery. I was also correct about the mixture of Ambien and red wine and the effect it would have on Jason's consciousness. I locked my discovery in the basement, secure from the doctors who would try to steal the credit of my findings. It didn't take much. Jason, through his transformation, was becoming physically weak. By the time he came over to my home, he was struggling to bear the weight of his own shoulders. A simple deadbolt and a chain for safe measure were enough to keep him down there. I would bring him meals and water once a day and document any noticeable changes made. If Jason ever tried to overpower me or make a run for it, the sound of my taser sparking would change his mind quickly. His family came looking for him, knocking on my door, asking if I'd seen him, and giving me posters to pass out and a number to call. Jason's sister was especially determined in her search. visiting me more than once with an accusatory tone each time. I was smart enough not to let her in. While you couldn't hear it from the porch, stepping far enough into my home would subject you to Jason's weak, pained whimpers and strained cries for help. They were almost non-stop, broken up only by the rare and short-lived moments he got to sleep. It was enough to make me pity him. Jason was a person before he became my discovery, and listening to the wailing pains of his necessary transformation from person to scientific marvel were enough to make me second-guess my work at times. I began checking on him less and less. I couldn't stand his pathetic begging to be set free each time I came down to study his changes, which were becoming more rapid by the day. One day, the mewling and whining stopped. I was certain that Jason had met some kind of untimely demise in the confines of my basement. Guilt washed over me as I climbed down the aged staircase leading into my experiment's den. It was dark, the light bulb long since burning out, and worse than that, it was quiet. It smelled damp, like a pipe had burst or something was leaking from the bowed wood ceiling into the uneven concrete floor. As I came to the bottom of the staircase, I was stunned into stillness by fear of what was waiting for me in that dark. I couldn't tell what was worse at this point, the idea that Jason could be dead, his half-mutated, mangled body rotting in the basement in front of me, or that he was still alive. Would I rather meet the corpse or the man? I had my question answered as I stepped foot on the concrete floor, and something in the darkness lashed out at me. I backed up quickly as what could only be described as a massive claw, made from fingers stretched and elongated out of their sockets and fused together by bone chitins, snapped at the air where my leg had just been. The sound was horrible, a loud clack like two sticks smacked together, followed by a creaking and fleshy tearing as the mutant claw struggled to open back up. Frantically, I scooted back up the stairs, clinging to the handrail as I ran backwards, my eyes glued on what was emerging from the darkness below me. What was once Jason's head came from out of the darkness, fused into his shoulder blades, which now protruded out to cover what would have been his ears. One eye was larger than the other, swollen and protruding and black, creating a mortifying contrast with the human eye that remained red from the tears that fell down his cheek. There was a slit separating the middle of his chin, making it hard for Jason to speak, as his jaw seemed to slack and fall in separate directions when he tried. It did not stop him from trying. "Please, hungry, hurt." I remember him whimpering, begging, a tone that sounded half like he needed my help and half like he was angry, like he'd snap my neck with that great big claw if he had the chance. I could hear more of that anger reflected as he spoke again, sucking in the spit that dribbled from his split jaw and shouting, "Please." My weight was shifted onto the handrail as I started in frozen awe at the terror before me. The weight caused the old wood to bend and snap, catting my hand and sending me falling nearly to the bottom of the stairs. At the sound of my scream, or maybe smell of my blood, Jason rushed for me, dragging himself forward with a terrible bony apparatus that must have once been an arm or a leg, snapping at me with his massive claw as he dragged terrible weight of his broken body up the stairs. I scampered back to the door, and while I was able to clear distance before he was able to catch me, he got close. I could feel in my bones what Jason would do to me if he caught me. I stared back down at him, peering up at me from the darkness, crying with his one human eye, as the black bulging bead on his right side seemed to stare at me. I shut the door and locked the locks. I never checked the basement again. Weeks went by. There was never the sound of whimpering or begging from the basement again, and I was determined to allow my mistake to die in the dark, where I didn't have to think about it ever again. Despite my wishes, the occasional banging against the door let me know Jason was still alive, smashing his claw against the wood and rattling the locks. This would only stop when I would open the chain door far enough to pass food through the gap. I would shut it quickly, pressing my back to the door each time in case Jason decided to finally break through the wood and attack me. He never did. Jason's sister kept coming back, kept threatening to call the police if I was keeping anything secret from her, The obvious gash on my hand and the dead look in my eyes were obviously making her suspicious. She'd come to my door and rant about how she knew something was up, that she was going to prove it, that if her brother was hurt or worse, she'd kill me. I'd just stare at her and think about how tired I was and how much I wish I could just give Jason back and forget any of this ever happened. Then, one day while she was on my porch, he started banging on the basement door. Startled, she pushed past me and ran to the basement. I was frozen for a moment as the shock of what happened kept me from fully processing what was going on. I thought about being caught, spending the rest of my life in prison for kidnapping or worse. Would I be blamed for the deterioration of Jason's condition? Would my scientific approach to the situation have any bearing in court whatsoever? Did I actually want to get caught so this nightmare would finally be over? When I saw her going for the door, I thought about Jason getting out. That thought scared me enough to spring into action. I rushed between her and the door. She screamed at me, shouted that she knew she was right, and pummeled my chest with her fists. The claw on the other side of the door banged harder, the pressure smashing into my back worse than anything she threw at me. She grabbed me by the shoulders and threw me to back away from the door. I lunged for her wrist, grabbing and pulling her back, begging her not to open that door. She didn't listen, shooting me a look filled with tears and anger. When she finally unlocked the door and threw it open, she glanced back towards the basement. I don't know what look she had then, but I can imagine it. The terror, at least, would have been brief. I watched as that giant claw lunged from out of the darkness and grabbed her leg. I saw her ankle twist in the brief moment before she hit the floor, her head bouncing off the wood with a fleshy thud, the fall taking me with her. I watched her twist and squirm, turning to face me. She dug her nails into the wood and screamed for help as she was dragged down the staircase, one long tug after the other, bringing her further down until everything below her shoulders was swallowed by the dark below. I saw that final horrible look on her face, tears streaking down her red cheeks, her eyes so wide they looked like they might pop out of their sockets. Then that massive claw came back from out of the dark and wrapped around her neck. It squeezed slowly, and I heard the cracking and grinding of the bones break. I watched her neck twist and her head fall limp, ending the screaming. Speechless, I simply laid there, watching as her limp body was dragged down the basement stairs. The air hung silent but for the sound of dragging and the thump as her corpse hit every stair on the way down, eventually disappearing into the darkness. I lay there for a moment, just staring at the darkness behind the basement door. I knew I should close it. I knew I should run, but I was terrified to move, terrified to bring any attention to the fact that I was still in the room, lest it come for me next. I didn't have to do anything, though. After a minute or so of silence, the thumping and creaking of the stairs continued once more. This time, my discovery had stuck his head out from the doorframe. A few strands of hair hung loosely from a shell made of his shoulder blades and rib cage. What had been his human eye was now black and bulging and split into two. The split down his chin was gone, with his separated jaw forming a mandible mouth that chittered at the sight of me. What had once been Jason had completely changed into something else. It was carcinization, evolution in its most unexpected, frightening form. The crab just looked at me for a moment, defenseless, shocked by its grotesqueness, ready to pay for my sins at the bite of a claw, but instead of attack, it simply reached up with its claw, grabbing the doorknob and shutting the door. I watched its eyes stare at me as it disappeared into the darkness. I'm trapped here. If I leave, I'll surely be arrested for murder, and who knows what will become of the crab. Will it kill, be killed, or even be claimed as someone else's discovery? Despite everything, I still want the credit for discovering this terrible evolution. Maybe it would make all of this mean something. It has to mean something, otherwise it was just a mistake. One that ruined my life and ended two others. I can't just stay here either. Tonight the house burns down, the crab with it. I'm posting this in hopes that when everything is discovered, I'm still credited with the discovery. I'm calling it hypercarcinization, and I hope I'm remembered for the discovery, and I hope some kind of cure or preventative measure can be developed to make sure this never happens to someone again. After I post this, I'm going to take a long, drug-induced sleep. I only hope that I don't wake up to the flames, or worse, in the crab's den with that horrible chittering maw and those dead black eyes staring back at me.